Welcome to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode brings us author, journalist, entrepreneur, and mountaineer Luke Timmerman.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hawksland, and I'm the CEO at New York Bio. We are thrilled you're here joining us for another edition of our virtual breakfast series. I think we said last week, I think we're right at 2 years. So we've had some amazing conversations, and today should prove no different. We're thrilled to have Luke Timmerman with us to talk all things biotech, reporting, mountaineering. I mean, Luke, what aren't you going to cover with us today in our discussion? A special thank you to our partners at Goodwin for sponsoring this month's series of breakfast. As housekeeping, as always, if you're not familiar or you're a new participant in our virtual breakfast discussion, it is a discussion. We like to have a sort of free-flowing conversation with our guests. So please, that includes your participation. Ask your questions in either the Q&A or the chat boxes. They're available to you on your screen. And Derek and I will get to those as we go through the course of our conversation. Luke, we're very excited to have you. I'll turn it over to Derek to kick us off in our conversation.
All right, Luke, thank you so much. And for the edification of our audience, be at least gentle in the beginning of the questions. Luke is joining us from the West Coast, and we always have an extra special appreciation for anyone that would get up at that hour just to come and be on a webinar with us. So, Luke, I think you're a pretty amazing figure in biotech. You've blazed new trails, both literally and figuratively, all over the place. This is going to be fun. So why don't we kind of wind the clock back and start with a little bit of an origin story? And why don't you tell us kind of how you got into biotech in the first place?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Derek and Jennifer, for having me. And I'm a morning person, so it's not too big a deal getting up for you guys. Great to be here with New York Bio. I got started covering the biotech industry a little over 20 years ago at the Seattle Times. So that's how I came out to the West. So I was just kind of generally trained as a journalist. I didn't study biology in college. Didn't really know what this thing was, biotech, exactly, like a lot of people.
I was going to say, yeah, that hasn't changed in 20 years.
Yeah. But I kind of quickly picked up. So this was 2001. And this thing, the Human Genome Project, was in the news quite a bit. And the editors were curious. Here in Seattle, there was a beginning cluster, a company called Immunex, which developed Enbrel. And at that time, it was, kind of a rocket ship of a stock, a real wonder drug for rheumatoid arthritis, which we can look back on now and say, yeah, that was a big milestone, the TNF inhibitors. And it was, I looked at this as a kind of a beginning business reporter, as a really cool place for storytelling. There was science, there was medicine, there was business. There were all these interesting characters. Like, who are these scientific entrepreneurs that'll take on these risky endeavors and lose money for 10 years in a row or more? And I mean, it was, and it changed really fast. There was a variety of companies working on cancer or immune disorders, at least here in Seattle. I just thought, and at the time as a kind of a beginning business reporter, Boeing and Microsoft were the big companies in town. That was what you ought to strive for, right? As a young business reporter. And biotech was sort of obscure. Who are these companies? But I looked at this and thought, I think this is kind of interesting. I'm going to give it a try. And it was really scary at first. I mean, the terminology, it was a very steep learning curve. But I was really very fortunate to have that newspaper environment where I only had to write maybe 3 articles a week on average. So I could get out of the office, take my time, go out and meet people and learn some fundamentals of the industry. and then try to translate that for a general audience of, curious business people who are not necessarily, biotech professionals. Biotech professionals in Seattle would have been, a part of the audience.
Yeah.
So I thought it was just really fantastic training. And then, the Immunex was the big company, as I said. They got acquired by Amgen right away, my first year. So like, boom, there's like big front page story, and young Luke has to like get all over this thing and find out what's going to happen. So it was, I was kind of hooked early on.
All right. So after the Seattle Times, you eventually made your way to Xconomy, because I remember when I met you, I think it was in 2011 or 2012, and it was at the Convergence conference. And it was one of the cool things, because I knew you because you wrote for Xconomy, and everyone read, the Xconomy, biotech side of things, and you were that voice. And it's like, oh, here's this person that like exists on the internet that I now actually get to meet in person. So you had a pretty, you basically took this journey from, generalist, biotech business reporter at a local, Seattle newspaper, to then national, and then eventually, striking out on your own. So what was that kind of progression like? How did you kind of go through all those things and, kind of realize you would get to a place where it's like, you know what, I can actually do this myself?
Yeah, well, so there was a disruption in the media business. So around the time I had been gaining more competence, shall we say, more comfort with coverage of biotech, about 5-6 years in, it was pretty clear that the newspaper industry was going through a major disruption. The internet was here. People were going to consume their news in a different way. Newspapers were going to have a hard time adapting to that change. Yep. That was pretty evident. So I started looking around. I wanted to stick with biotech. I found a passion here, and I just needed to figure out what was the venue for it. And a couple interim steps. I took a fellowship year off at MIT it's called the Knight Science Journalism Fellowship Program, which is a fantastic thing.
Oh, cool.
Like a sabbatical year. And I got to, meet a whole bunch of people from the Harvard MIT world and Boston biotech. So I started spreading my wings a little bit, left to go work at Bloomberg News, prominent New York company.
Yep.
and got to cover national biotech. So kind of branching out from regional coverage to now it's Genentech, Gilead, Amgen, and covering their earnings, their big deals, all that kind of stuff for a financial audience. So I'm exploring at this point kind of different ways of covering biotech, let's say. Now, after a year or two, I got the startup opportunity with Xconomy. And this is really important because, to me, that was a chance to build something from the ground up. It's born on the internet, different business model. There was going to be events. There was going to be some advertising supported content. There were some other things too, but that was like, you could establish, a brand for quality, and focus on biotech professionals, like sophisticated readers, and dig deeper into some of the stories than I could previously. And it was just a lot of fun. I learned a lot about how companies are built, both my own, where I worked as a very early employee, but also interviewing people who were starting their companies. Like, well, how did they think about the market and what they were building and offering, and how did it all match up? And partly Xconomy also kind of lit my fire because it was focused on the most innovative aspects of biotech. So back at Bloomberg, where you're writing about generally big companies, big stocks, what was going to, so if a phase 3 Avastin trial came through, that would move Genentech stock, and that was big news. But, the the kind of the skunkworks project that's going on there,
Right.
that wasn't really what they were looking for, and I missed that. So I got to indulge that at Economy, and really, had a great run there, 5-6 years, and then decided that I wanted to go out and do my own thing. Now I did an interim step there again while I was figuring it out. I wrote a book on Lee Hood. And so I needed a little time and space to finish the book and also think about, well, what did I really want to do longer term? What was the business model that I wanted to line up with my biotech journalism? So came to the conclusion that subscriptions were going to be the way. And that was sort of the genesis of Timmerman Report.
Yeah. Well, I will tell you, I've read your book, and I'm going to actually put the Amazon link in the chat. It's really good. It's a story of Lee Hood, who's just an absolute pioneer in sequencing and a groundbreaking scientist in Seattle. If you like those kind of stories, it's great. I will give it the full-throated plug now. So there you go. Thank you. Luke and I already worked out the residual contract. It's fine. You don't need to worry about that.
You better have some other form of income, Derek. I gotta say.
I was like, yeah, the New York Bio outside counsel has not reviewed this yet and would be likely to disapprove any agreement. Talk to us, Luke. Just sort of take a step back, right? Take a step back and talk to us about how you decided what your role sort of in the biotech media ecosystem. Like, how did you decide that what people needed, like what was missing in the market that gave you this entrepreneurial opportunity?
Well, I think that has evolved somewhat, but I heard things when I was at Economy from readers, often at events, who would say things like, I read your article and it, or no, you wrote about our company before anybody else did. And you told the story in a clear and simple way. And we ended up having a meeting with the BD guy at Merck after this, and it actually led to a partnership. Or, I found that company where I wanted to go work. I took a job there after reading it. Or, people said things that were like kind of life-changing. And so I was digging into something deeper about these companies, like explaining the science in a clear way, but also the business, how it linked to the business strategy and how people fit in. And that last part, I think, was definitely something that was more seldom seen in biotech coverage. So I built this very avid and loyal readership based on kind of that combination of factors. And I remember I was at a publication that gave away all its content for free on the internet.
Yes.
And we had to do events and sell tickets, and it was like quite a struggle to keep the lights on that way. And I just thought, gosh, if I can, if I'm really delivering this kind of value to the reader, can I ask them to subscribe at a low, reasonable price? Can I tap into some of that loyal readership? It started out as $99 a year. Can I get some of these people who are getting this kind of value to pay $99 a year to support this kind of independent, deep probing journalism? And that was like 2014, 2015. Like, this was before Substack and everything. And a lot of people said, no way, like information on the internet is free, right? And so
right.
it was a pretty daring, risky thing. But I had some confidence based on, that anecdotal feedback that I had. And, the first couple months, I got to, a few hundred subscribers pretty early. So just kind of on speculation based on, we know you and we have confidence that you're going to deliver more of that quality for the next year. So basically I had like minimum viability. I had, and so I could continue. I don't know if that answers your question.
It pretty much does. I think so. I mean, I think there's a lot of, one of the things that you said, there's a lot of you in what you write, and I don't know if that's by design or it's just the way that it ends up on the page. But I think, at least personally, that's one of the things that I think, I found that I connected with. And I find that we have, leading writers and journalists in biotech that each kind of bring a little bit of a different angle to what they actually try to write. So I did have an interest to see
Derek, that's something that changed. So back in the newspaper days, learning at the Seattle Times, that was one of those cardinal rules: don't keep yourself out of the story, just the facts.
Right.
And that was how I did it. And that was a change when social media came along, and say the late aughts, early 2010s. It became clear that readers want to know a little bit more about the person who's doing the writing. And it was around that time too when I became a columnist. So then, like, when you become a columnist, this has been more than 10 years now, like, that's part of your job, is to bring that first person eye. And I spoke to somebody, and I've got like a different insight or a different perspective here that goes beyond just the facts. So I'm supposed to have an opinion, but I'm also supposed to share transparently my perspective and where it comes from. So like that, there's a confluence of a couple things going on there, and I had to lean in on that. And that actually, was the bridge to like this mountaineering stuff too.
But we're definitely going to talk about that. But before you get to that, I've seen that even in other sort of national newspaper publications where journalists, right, that we read their reporting, you're right, like even a decade ago, are now in writing opinion columns because they're, they went to become a columnist, and then now they're more firmly in the opinion section. So it's good though that newspapers are recognizing and being transparent about the sort of, I guess, the bent of each columnist so that they're characterizing it correctly.
Yeah. I mean, it can be a two-edged sword, but I think the readers, at least in my experience, would say that they appreciate sharing some of that perspective. Like, I'm originally from Wisconsin. I'm a farm boy, blue collar upbringing. Like, we were kind of trained to like keep that out and pretend that we were, empty objective vessels of truth seeking, which, we really, the way I think of it, we need to go out and pursue the facts with intellectual honesty. Like if you're writing something hard about somebody who, did something that's not quite right, there's some basic fairness, like you need to seek their comment and, present it properly. I mean, but at the same time, we news gatherers or journalists are human beings, and we do have our perspective, and there's nothing really wrong with that. In fact, it's okay to level with the reader, and because each of us brings something different. Men, women, older, younger, people of color, like that perspective informs who we are, how we make choices, what we cover, what we don't, why we focus on something so hard versus some other issue that we might not pay attention to at all.
Do you ever kind of experience the other end of the sword? I mean, I think the easiest example here is, Adam Feuerstein gets, accused daily of like, manipulating short stocks because he, deigns to write about, things that aren't working well at various companies and things. So do you ever experience any of that kind of backlash, either from a market perspective or anything, where, you people say, oh, you obviously, own stock in this company and you're trying to get rich or something like that? Do you ever kind of get that level of feedback from folks?
Oh, I mean, if you're around long enough in this business, you're going to encounter trolls. I don't tend to engage or feed the trolls very much. I mean, I know Adam and like Adam, and we're contemporaries, and but he likes to sometimes mix it up with the trolls, and
He does.
that kind of further inflames these kind of wild, baseless accusations that people sometimes make.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, especially like early in my career, I did more investigative reporting. And so yeah, when you're encountering the target of an investigation, they'll make they will often make accusations about your motives, or yeah, you got to have a thick skin for doing this
Yeah,
kind of
I
work.
imagine. So the one other thing on the reporting side before we head off into the mountains, you were also one of the people that I think really kind of pioneered, a real multimedia approach. Before it was common for people to have a podcast, or if webinars like this started popping up everywhere. You and Meg Terrell, I think, had one of the earliest biotech focused podcasts, and now you've kind of adapted this into the Timmerman report too. So can you talk a little bit about how you kind of decided to break out into it? What were some of the things that you thought about, and maybe what are some of the ways that it changed when you brought it onto the Timmerman report?
Yeah, well, I think this is another aspect of becoming entrepreneurial in journalism, like experimenting with things, figuring out what the audience wants, what I want to do as well. So podcasting, I guess it started, gosh, if you really think about it, I mean, back at Economy, as I said, we did events. So that was a form of, I guess you could call it live journalism, where you get up in front of an audience and you're emceeing or moderating a panel. You've got to have some prepared questions. You're conducting an interview on stage, but you also need to listen in the moment and be ready with the follow-up and kind of quick on your feet. So like I broke through really some initial shyness, got over that, did what had to be done, found that people liked it. I actually found it kind of suited me pretty well. And it was only kind of natural to go from there to appearing on local NPR here in Seattle. They would have questions periodically about events in the news, and I would come on and be the person interpreting for, that NPR kind of audience. So I got to practice, with the microphones and tools of the trade, and things were okay on the radio. And this would have been, so a couple years go by. Stat was getting started just a little bit after Timmerman report. So I was I was already up and running and feeling pretty good about where I was, and Stat was getting started, and they had this big ambitious idea. And Rick Burke, the executive editor, came to me and said, "Hey, we'd like you to be a part of this somehow, some way." And I said, "Well, how about a podcast?" So I proposed this this idea with Meg and I. And so we got to work together on that produced show. So we came up with this format. It was about 20 minutes long. We would have a designated theme for each week, or I can't remember, maybe it came out once every 2 weeks. I can't remember, but so we would divide and conquer. Like, she would interview a couple people, I'd interview a couple people, and we had a producer who would kind of put together a nice little 20-minute or so Radio Lab kind of segment. And so that's what we did for a little over a year. And got to a pretty good audience. I forget, maybe close to 10,000 listeners.
Wow.
But this being, an entrepreneurial, disrupted kind of world, I mean, I think we got the memo that podcasts were, in this explosive growth phase. And basically, if you weren't like Joe Rogan or something, the advertisers weren't really there. So that went away. But I thought, I could do something myself with long form interviews where I could also help promote Timmerman report and give people, a way to kick the tires, an on-ramp, so to speak. Like if you like this free offering as a podcast, if you like the style of interviewing and the mix of topics, the guests, then maybe you might want to subscribe. So that was kind of the thought there. And I really, now this is, we're getting a little further along here, and like some of the bloom is off the rose on social media for me at this point. And I'm thinking, I think what the audience really needs are more of these long form pieces of content, like a full hour long interview, as opposed to, say, a tweet.
Right.
And you can consume it, on your own time, or half here and half over there, however it fits in your day. But I wanted to consciously slow down a little bit and ask some deeper questions that I didn't think were always getting asked in the current forms.
Speaking of that and how you've evolved, right, with your product and the Timmerman report, talk to us about your audience and who you aim to engage. And is it different from who you wanted to engage at Economy or at the Seattle Times or other publications?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it is different from Seattle Times. So that would have been like general readership, sort of like an NPR, curious, educated people, but not biotech professionals. Biotech professionals being sort of like a small cohort within that larger group. Economy was more, well, and Bloomberg News, I should stop there too, because that was like global financial audience. So think of like the person who runs, portfolio management at T. Rowe Price or something that has a Bloomberg terminal. But again, not a biology degree, maybe went to, an Ivy League school or something. So it's a curious person. You don't dumb down your content to them. You treat that reader with respect and assume curiosity, but yeah, not a biotech professional. Right. And so you use your language accordingly. Then Economy, now that's explicitly biotech professionals. But here's the thing, like Economy was built up from a base of the idea that tech and biotech would be covered in geographic clusters. So we had staff writers who covered the tech side, I covered the biotech side. And so our thought was, I want to write a biotech story that, the guy at Amazon here in Seattle can read and appreciate. So it's still kind of like that same style that I would have been using at Bloomberg. And it was really good practice too, because we would edit each other. So like I was an editor and I would get like a story about Amazon. And I would say to the writer, well, what is this thing like API? What does that mean, right? Can you explain this to like a biotech person? And it was so like, it was good practice to like really clarify, say what you mean, make it easy. Don't make the reader do a whole lot of work or go to a dictionary. And so I think that was good pressure on me too, because those tech people would say the same thing to me about some of these biotech terms. Primary endpoint, what's that? Okay.
They could ask you what an API is, quite honestly.
that too. Yeah. So the now Timmerman report, I'd say it's similar to the Economy audience. It's biotech professionals, scientists, executives, investors, largely venture capital. But I don't cover too very much of the public stocks. I tend to focus on the early startups. It's just I enjoy talking with people as they're figuring out their company and their strategy, and I don't think there's as much coverage of companies there, so there's a nice niche for someone like myself. But it's also a group of people now who are curious about how the biotech industry connects to the society at large. So I talk a lot about the issues around, say, drug pricing, access, kind of, how we link up with that wider world of healthcare and where the fault lines are, rather than, strictly business, like what's the stock market doing today? That would be more of a strictly contained business topic. I've ventured out a lot in these last few years toward those linkages with the broader society, how biotech can build bridges, how we can work together and coexist better. And I think that sensibility, that set of topics, tends to attract its own audience of people who are more interested in those set of topics. They're now coming to me.
Well, and if you think about it, let's take New York Bio, right, as an example of an ecosystem in which you're engaging that audience. We have large companies, we have small companies and startups, we have academic institutions, we have patient advocates and patients, and all of those other businesses that make biotech work. So they're not just scientists. And so as a lawyer by training, right, I appreciate that sort of broad distinction and the connections. So I think that that's important for people to remember, that the industry itself is much broader and has a lot more connection points to to our patients in particular.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it speaks directly to the mission of biotech. If you're an industry that's about alleviating suffering of patients, you really do need to be plugged in on their issues. But these bigger things about pricing and access and it's. Yeah, I think there are a lot of people who see, we got some work to do. The good news is we've got such incredible science. I mean, I could talk about biotech. I mean, the science is just better than ever, like so much further ahead than it was 20 years ago when I started. And so there's so much more potential to really alleviate suffering and death on a large scale. So it's part of my job to encourage people to really think these issues through, how to get the industry and healthcare on a more sustainable footing.
So I think this is an appropriate time. Dennis Purcell says hello, and he asked you in his question, what worries you most about the industry today? What keeps you up at night in your reporting?
Well, hey, Dennis. Dennis is one of the people that I knew from way back when at Economy. Great to hear from you. Yeah, I think what worries me is just this very thing, like figuring out a better balance with pricing and access. We've seen, like, with COVID, for example, these last couple of years, a really big achievement with vaccines and therapeutics and the diagnostics as well. There was real trouble with getting all of these innovations out to all the people who need them in a timely manner, and getting the society to trust the data that has been generated. So there's a trust gap out there, and I think that worries me a lot. You start to see things like routine children's vaccinations starting to go down. And I'm not talking about COVID, I'm talking about like measles, mumps, rubella and other things too. And so we've got some work to do. And it's not just biotech, it's a whole set of industry stakeholders. I worry about that, and what are we doing to rebuild that credibility and that trust, and in service of, coming back to the original point, like, if you come out with a really good cancer drug or something for rare disease, we all want that to get out to everyone who needs it, not, 30% of the eligible patient population at our desired price. Like, I wouldn't call that success. So I think but of course we need incentives to, develop new therapies. So like, how do you square that circle? That's our challenge.
Yeah. So why don't we pivot a little bit here, because in the middle of the last, however long, you started with something that I think is really, really impactful. And for a little bit of background, Luke has led multiple expeditions to various kind of high peaks around the world with basically teams of people within biotech promoting basically raising money for Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, raising money for Life Science Cares, and really kind of doing some exceptional team building stuff. But that all kind of started with you. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how that started, and we'll spend kind of the rest of the time here talking about that interpersonal impact that you have, which I think has just been amazing.
Well, thanks, Derek, because I've really become passionately engaged in this stuff the last 5 years. So I guess it starts with about 5 years ago. I mean, I had this little mountaineering hobby going on in the background, and I never wrote about it. I thought, well, who cares? That's just my personal thing I do with my buddies on the weekend. But I went on a trip to Denali back at Economy 2013, I guess it was. And some of my friends at the time on the staff encouraged me to share some pictures. And I shared these pictures of my trip to Denali, and it was the most read thing I wrote all year.
Really?
and I thought, I don't know how I should feel about this. But it's sort of like what I did on my summer vacation. Who cares? But
apparently a lot of people.
they did, and so it got some gears turning. So fast forward by about 2017, now I had climbed the highest peak in South America as well as Denali. So I had kind of the climbing resume to think about a trip to one of the big Himalayan peaks, including Everest. So I was kind of ready there. And the company that I had started had now achieved stability. I had met my interim goals. Like I knew I could make a living doing this. And, had won a lot of, maybe it's like midlife crisis kind of stuff, had won a bunch of awards and accomplished a lot of these goals, and had, even in the early days of Timmerman Report, got on one of these lists for like most influential people in biotech, which really got me thinking, okay, if I really do have this platform of influence and I use it to write columns, share my opinions, encourage people to do some of these things I think they ought to do, well, that's fine and good, but is there something more? Can I get people to take direct action on some of these things that I care about? So putting these pieces together, I thought, all right, if I were to climb Mount Everest, highest mountain in the world, what could I do with that? Well, I could probably animate, electrify this group of biotech people to give to a cause that's important to me. And Fred Hutch Cancer Center here in Seattle, where I'm based, has this long-term program called Climb to Fight Cancer. They'd had people come climb mountains like Mount Rainier and raise $5,000 or $10,000 for a loved one or something like that. Nobody had ever climbed Mount Everest before through this program. So I made a proposal. They went with it, set an ambitious goal of raising $175,000. I thought, oh my God, I've never done anything like this before. What's going to happen? Like, am I going to have to sell my house if I can't do this? But I took on the challenge, figured it out, doubled the goal, and summited Mount Everest in 2018. It was a huge, huge success, and set the stage for a much bigger community building effort, which followed the year later on Kilimanjaro. I put together a group of 27 biotech people and charged them with raising $50,000 apiece for cancer research. to come on this great trip. And it was a diverse group of people, men, women, old, young, and we all got together, had a great time, raised $1.6 million. Everybody summited Kilimanjaro together, and they became friends and colleagues. And so this reverberated through the community as well, and really got me excited about, as I said, using this platform to lead to direct action on behalf of cancer patients. But now it's also expanded to anti-poverty work through Life Science Cares, which is a phenomenal organization. If people don't know about it, check it out online. But Life Science Cares mobilizes the biotech community to support our most vulnerable neighbors in our geographic hubs. And so I had covered it. So I knew the founders, but this was around, pandemic time when I was like a little stir crazy, a little antsy at home, needing to get outside. I thought, can I come up with something that's closer to home and that people might be able to do for just a couple of days? Like a Kilimanjaro trip is, it's a big undertaking, 11 days door to door, overseas travel.
Yeah.
Not everyone could do it. So I came up with this thing we call the Timmerman Traverse. It's a presidential traverse in New Hampshire, which you can do. It's 20 miles, 8,000 feet of elevation gain, a couple of days. You can stay in huts. So you can get a warm meal at the end of the day and the beginning of the day. And you can get some of that same camaraderie with your biotech peers while, pushing yourself to do something physically challenging and giving back to a good cause. So we did that last September. It's a big success, and now we're going to repeat this. So this has turned into, I mean, more than like a part-time job. I don't know. I spend a lot of time on this now, and I think I can do a couple of these trips per year. Grand total, all of these expeditions have raised more than $4 million for cancer research and anti-poverty. And I think the sky is the limit. I think I'm going to keep doing this as long as I can.
Yeah. Well, I was talking to someone last week who was I think was on the original Kilimanjaro trip. And, her feedback was that this group really has, developed this level of camaraderie where, they talk to each other when they're thinking about taking a new job. There's an expertise thing. They're like the initial consults for each other on all sorts of areas of expertise within the community. And, when you started this, was that part of the goal? Was it just something that happened? Like, how have you evolved? Have you now kind of put more of that into what you do and what you think about here? How's it changed from the first one, where I imagine the goal was like, get up to the top of Mount Everest, look around, see the view, and then, kind of think about what you did on the way down. How have things changed since the first one?
Well, Everest was a totally different thing because that was just me as a climber, right, with a mixed group of climbers from around the world, very small, like, and not something that you can ask newcomers to do.
Yeah,
it's a lot. It's a lot.
Right. I mean, people get this like false idea that, anybody can do it. No. You need like 15 years of experience if you really want to do it. And the right fitness and everything. But but I did learn a lot about teamwork and leadership, especially from the guides, because these mountain guides on Everest, they are really good at what they do. And I watched and learned. And so I'd say, to answer your question, did I really anticipate the full flowering of the camaraderie and how meaningful those relationships would be on multiple levels for people? Not really. Because the goals were, blow through the $1 million fundraising goal for Kilimanjaro and get everybody up to the top and down safely. So like, have a good time doing it.
Yeah.
I did very much take note and realize that the act of pushing yourself outside that comfort zone, doing something physically challenging, enjoying nature, it naturally fosters this, there's a vulnerability that comes with that. Like
Mhm.
you're not wearing your business suit and tie out there on the trail. Like, and if you're, you get up to 12,000 feet and this is the highest you've ever been and you're kind of sucking wind, like there's no like hiding in the other
Yes.
room. Like
Mhm.
everyone, and everyone is in the same boat, right? So like a lot of the, the usual um, mm, defense mechanisms or whatever that shields that we
Yeah.
put up in our daily
Yeah.
work, those things come down. And what you do instead is like you extend a helping hand,
Right.
because you're going to do that for your neighbor when they need a drink of water or a little rest, just like they're going to do it for you. And I
Mhm.
think that right there is like what cements the bonds.
Yeah.
It happens pretty quickly, actually, on the trail, and people just. I've heard people say it's been life changing for them to be on these trips, and I very much want to lean in on this and continue to select people who provide a mix of perspectives, and and are going to be those kind of good teammates on the
Yeah.
trail. Um, and so far, we've really just I've been very fortunate.
And do
Yeah.
you think that
I
there's a because I like to hike as well and have done Mount Washington. Although I do not join my husband, he does it in the winter and the summer. I do not do the ice climbing in the winter on Mount Washington. But do you find that there is an appetite for something that people can do in say 3 or 4 days here? Obviously it's a much different commitment level than an international trip, especially I think probably COVID may have upended that a little bit as well.
Yeah, so I have. I've heard people say, "Gosh, I'd really like to join your Kilimanjaro or your Everest Base Camp trek, but it's too long. I can't take that much time off." So that was part of what stirred the thinking
Okay.
around creating the Presidential Traverse. It's also a different time of year. It's best to do it in about September. So like I can kind
yeah.
of like stagger these things through the year. So like, yeah, I can still do my job most of the time and like pop in a trip, spring,
Yeah.
fall, summer. Um, so so yes, and I'm really excited about that Timmerman Traverse coming up in September for that reason. And I one thing I'm beginning to see too is that once people get a taste of what it's like to do this, they start thinking, maybe I could go climb Mount Rainier, see what it's like to,
Yeah.
have an ice axe and a harness and some
I know.
crampons, go on a glacier. And so people have, if they're curious about that, I can talk you through some of the options. But yeah, so I think there's going to be like a portfolio of trips, the shorter domestic and the longer international.
And at the end of the day,
Yeah.
you're still doing two things that are really important. You're raising funds that are desperately needed for these important programs, and you're building a community among the participants.
Absolutely right. And community building is part of what journalism does.
Yeah.
I mean, we've always that's just part of our basic professional principles, is that we're supposed to create this shared set of facts, and people can discuss the issues of the day on our platforms. And so yeah, I mean, community building through journalism, but now community building through mountaineering as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thread that emerges kind of when you think about all of your experience here is you're you're basically working a lot with the people that are kind of driving the industry forward, right? When you think about these smaller biotech companies, you think about the stories that you're able to tell. A lot of it is, these are the people that are actually going to represent the next phase of wherever our industry gets to. And that's, at the same time, both important and interesting, right? And I think you've done a really big service to the industry by, helping bring people together in another forum. I think getting people out of the office and doing things with people in your industry that is not work related. It's not a conference. It's not anything like that. I think it's a really powerful thing for all of the reasons that you've mentioned.
Well, it's funny you mentioned like people driving the future, because I definitely feel that too. That a lot of the people who are drawn to my publication or my trips, I mean, I look at their professional work and I think, wow, I mean, you really are the person who invested in like, the coolest new cell therapy or gene therapy or gene editing kind of technologies. I'm in awe of the things that these people do. And interestingly too, now maybe you can explain this to me, but students, graduate students and postdocs, young people coming up into the industry have always been a really high affinity group of readers, listeners for my particular content, going back to Economy, but very much now as well, even though like a lot of them are listening to the podcast because, they don't have the budget to subscribe, but sometimes they can, talk to the librarian at their institution. And so there's a few of the big institutions have group Timmerman report subscriptions. They love it. I mean, the podcast in particular, it's like, because I talk about people's career turning points, like key decisions. Why did you do this? How did this happen for you? And I think young people in particular find this really instructive as they think about like, how do they take their scientific training and apply it in an impactful way? Because there's, they don't get a whole lot of career counseling generally. There's no like obvious roadmaps to industry necessarily. Everybody has a different story that we can learn from. And so, I think that, well, I love having those people in my audience, and I think it bodes pretty well for like the future of what I do, because eventually they're going to go take jobs somewhere in industry, and then they can then they can get a subscription and tell their friends, and so it's a good group of people.
I mean, we've seen this. I mean, New York has the largest population of graduate students and postdocs anywhere in the world, and they have consistently been this interested, aggressive group of people that is kind of hungry to do more in science. We've seen more of it on the entrepreneurial side here. And we've also seen, now with, as difficult as it is to get a faculty position, we've seen much more appetite for going into industry. And, it's been wonderful. I think it's one of the reasons that from the people we talk to that have started companies in New York and have recruited from here, they love the fact that group of people is passionate and like, ready to kind of jump into things.
I think it's really smart if you can tap into that energy and enthusiasm, because this is a group, as you know, that doesn't get catered to a whole lot. But there's just so much potential there.
Yeah. We've actually had we'll give a last question from the audience. From Andy Spencer. It says, Luke, the long run is so good and I want it more often, weekly. Have you ever thought of expanding the mandate of the podcast to cover wider topics while also recruiting other contributors to help spread the content creation workload?
Well, thank you. I'm glad people like listening. I have thought about different forms of interviews. So every now and then I'll get more than one guest and I'll have a focused topic that doesn't get into the career background. So I will play around a little bit. I've tried a couple newsy type, so I can do news interviews. Like, and I remember doing one with George Scangos early on with the neutralizing antibody work in COVID. Or Larry Corey talking about like Operation Warp Speed when that was just getting started. Right. So those were like 20 or 30-minute interviews, just focused on the newsy topic, none of the other stuff. So I'm willing to experiment. And occasionally, I'll hear someone who does their own thing who I think, they're a pretty good interviewer. Maybe they could come in. So if you have an idea, send it my way.
it is, well, I mean, it's appropriate, right? We experiment with new things and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. If we're not experimenting in our industry, then we're probably not taking a cue from our colleagues doing drug discovery and development.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, we've got a couple minutes left. And, as someone who has, managed to just, blaze this really interesting path, I would love to hear from you where you think things are going. We're at an interesting time, right? We have depressed public markets. We have a lot of private funds. What is it that you see, kind of happening now from either an innovation standpoint, a company standpoint, an industry standpoint, that you think we're going to see in the next kind of 3 to 5 years?
Good question. It reminds me a little bit of the the post-financial crisis time. So, I mean, people, I don't know how many, Dennis Purcell, if you're still on, you'll remember this. 2008 to 2012 was this pretty dark period where, you had similar dynamics with the markets being depressed and a lot of investors shying away from high risk, high reward sectors like biotech. And there was just nowhere near the volume. I mean, there was no IPO market at all. There was
that window was shut.
It was impossible, and there weren't that many M&A deals. There were, venture capital was funding at a trickle. Like $20 million Series A was like big news, and it would happen maybe once a week. So I sound like an old man here, but that was 10, 15 years ago. So we've been through this incredible bull run for 10 years. And now there's going to be a retrenchment. We're seeing it now with the stocks coming down, and unfortunately layoffs. That was another characteristic of that time. But I do think that the science will continue. It is continuing, as I said earlier. It's in a much better place than it's ever been. Your probability of success for so many different things is much higher when you're building off of like a more elucidated foundation of biology. So I'm long-term optimistic that this industry is going to just continue. This is a cycle. This isn't a secular decline or like complete disruption like I experienced in my industry with media. Like media that I came up in was permanently disrupted. And like a whole generation of journalists that I grew up in and went to college with are gone and never coming back. They had to find other lines of work. So like my perspective on this is, I mean, it might sound kind of callous or blasé to people who, I don't want it to sound that way. Like if people have a layoff and they lose their job, it's hard, it's stressful. But in biotech, the fundamentals of the industry are so strong that my counsel is like, keep your chin up, find another place to work. There will be another good project for people with good skills and experience and willingness to work. So this is a cyclical dip, and biotech will be back.
Luke, thank you so much for participating today. We've really enjoyed the conversation, and I know our audience has as well. Thank you to Goodwin again for sponsoring, and we will look forward to seeing everybody next Tuesday morning.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.